Testing 1, 2, check. Yeah.
Good evening. Welcome to St. Mary's Kerrisdale. We have turned the fans on and opened the windows and stuff, but hey, it's July. If it was raining, we'd be complaining about that. If you need to find washrooms, they are straight through here. Women's is on that side, men is on that side, and there is a non-gender one kind of next to the women's washroom. So feel free to sneak out if you need to. My name is Roberta Fraser. I'm the associate priest here at St. Mary's. And I am going to turn it over to Richard to introduce our speaker. I would encourage those of you who are sitting further back to, you're not going to be able to see the screen very well if you're not moving forward.
Thank you. Good evening, friends. I'm so grateful for our partnership with St. Mary's Anglican Church here in Kerrisdale. We share this annual Visiting Distinguished Scholar Lecture each year, thanks to a generous donation from a member of this congregation. In addition to teaching a course at our summer school, the Visiting Distinguished Scholar offers a public lecture for the upbuilding of the Christian church here in the sanctuary of St. Mary's. I want to say thank you, too, to the Reverend Roberta Fraser for her gracious welcome this evening and for all the support that she's given us to make this event possible and to live stream it. Welcome to those who are online this evening. Dr. Jehu Hanciles is the D.W. and Ruth Brooks Professor of World Christianity and Director of Candler School of Theology's World Christianity Program at Emory University in Atlanta. He has lived and worked in Sierra Leone, Scotland, and as a Presbyterian, that's kind of the Holy Land, Zimbabwe, and the United States, and he's been a visiting professor at schools around the world. Before coming to Candler in 2012, Professor Hanciles was Associate Professor of the History of Christianity and Globalization and the Director for the Center of Missiological Research at Fuller Theological Seminary in California. His latest research surveys the history of global Christian expansion through the lens of migration, and his new book is entitled Migration and the Making of Global Christianity. He's written and published on many issues related to the history of Christianity, notably the African experience and globalization, including euthanasia of a mission, African church autonomy in a colonial context. He also wrote in Beyond Christendom, Globalization, African Migration, and the Transformation of the West. And in this work, he highlights the role of migration in the spread of Christianity, which makes the book, according to one reviewer, highly important to a more polycentric approach to the history of world Christianity. His article, The Future of Missiology as a Discipline, was one of the top 10 most read articles in missiology in 2015. He serves as the associate editor of Missiology, one of the premier journals in mission studies, and he's on the editorial advisory committee for Baylor University Press's studies in world Christianity. I've benefited a great deal from reading his work, and so it's a delight to welcome Professor Hanciles to speak to us this evening on the topic of global migration and Christian witness. Welcome, Jehu.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Richard, for that wonderful introduction. I'm taking you with me everywhere after this. Friends, it's a great privilege to be with you, to be what I understand to be a visiting distinguished scholar, to give the visiting distinguished scholars lecture. I understand that I stand in a long and honorable tradition. Many thanks to Professor Topping for the invitation and for the welcome and hospitality I've enjoyed so far, including a very recent meal that included duck that is going to give me the stamina I need for this evening's session. Thanks to all those online who are joining us, and I feel that this topic is of great import and hugely central to our time and as Christians, and definitely crucial for the ministry of the church. So I want to talk about global migrations and Christian witness with an emphasis on major trends and transformations. Friends, human migration is a fact of history. As long as human beings have been on the planet, resettlement, relocation, displacement, and population transfers have been central to the human condition. You can understand why migration has been described as an irrepressible human urge. Experts would tell you that migration has been crucial for many different aspects of human development, including the growth of the world, development of states and societies, and the enrichment of many cultures and civilizations. But the impact of human migration on religious existence is quite simply profound. The global religious landscape today is very complex and constantly evolving. But the worldwide spread of belief systems is largely the product of extraordinary migrant movements. Until the birth of telecommunications in the late 19th century, all aspects of culture were transported by people. Now, migrants don't take everything with them, as those of you who have been migrants know, but they take a lot, including their ideas, beliefs, religious practices, and spirituality. If I would make the case that the role of migration in the global expansion of Christianity, or the Christian faith, arguably provides the most exemplary model, in part because within the history of Christianity, migrant movement is not simply incidental to the story or merely a function of historical happenstance. Unlike some other major religious traditions, migration is both intrinsic to the Christian faith and integral to Christian mission. By the way, just to remind you, we encounter every major form of migration in the biblical account. You can even make a strong case that the biblical story and message would be meaningless without migration and mobility. From a biblical perspective, migration emerges as both a metaphor for the life of faith and a distinctive feature of divine purposes. Well, that brings us to the present. Now, no matter where you get your news, or even if you've taken time off from the news, which I'm sure many of you do from time to time for mental health reasons, coverage of desperate migrants and displaced populations worldwide is a constant. That's something that's difficult to escape. The perils and tragedies surrounding global migration remain one of the most dominant and distressing themes of our time. Never in the history of humankind has migrant movement been this voluminous, unrelenting, and extensive. There are now more people on the move globally than ever before. By 2020, according to UN estimates, there were 281 million international migrants, people living outside their country of birth in the world. This is the highest number of people living abroad in recorded history. I often tell audiences that if they all lived in the same place, that place would be the world's fourth largest country. But when it comes to human migration, statistical data, of which I'll share a few, never really quite tell the whole story or even convey an accurate picture. Because even as I'm putting this up, more people have moved. more people have been displaced. There have been more dynamic migration movement. So migrant data is never complete. Okay, that's I should say it's always incomplete, which is something we have to live with. But behind these numbers, this statistical data, are often hidden cases of human suffering, ruined lives, and unimaginable pain. In 2019, nearly one person was forcibly displaced every 2 seconds as a result of persecution and violence. By the end of 2022, over 108 million people had been displaced worldwide, and children accounted for 40% of that number. But as horrendous as this is, I want to remind you, and this is something we'll come back to later, the religious dimension of these global flows is usually not appreciated in much analysis. Based on the latest data we have, which is rather old now, it's 2012, Christians constitute almost half of the world's international migrants, which is to say there are more Christians among the world's migrants and displaced peoples than any other faith. Okay? And we'll get to the numbers in a minute. But ultimately, these flows captured on your screen are both expression and indictment of our broken world. And it should be abundantly clear by now, although you won't believe this from some of the political debates, that this phenomenal tide of human migration is unmanageable and unstoppable. And I want to use a recent event to make this point, and I want to make it substantially. And trigger warning, I want to revisit some of the details of the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember, the pandemic erupted in a world already marked by a tidal wave of international migrants. So for a while at least, it looked like global mobility would never be the same again. Within a matter of weeks, at least 171 countries had implemented travel bans and border closures. By May 2020, 90% of the world's population lived in countries with largely closed borders. By mid-May 2022, just over 2 years later, the novel coronavirus had killed over 1 million people in the US alone. Those are staggering figures. I believe the corresponding figure in Canada is just over 40,000. Entire families were wiped out in the process. And the impact was disproportionately on poorer and brown populations. Now, here's the thing. In wealthy countries, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities suffered the most during the pandemic, especially immigrants. In fact, for immigrant populations, especially in the West, the pandemic intensified aspects of life that were already a source of anguish and pain. From the beginning, the outbreak galvanized pre-existing anti-immigrant sentiments and intensified suspicions of foreigners all around the world. The fact that the pandemic raised these kinds of hostility and antagonism towards outsiders was striking for 2 reasons. First, immigrant populations were the worst affected, in part because they were overrepresented in the hardest hit industries and were more likely than other sections of the population to lack access to health care. But the second reason, and more importantly, immigrants were overrepresented on the front lines of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see from your slides, percentages of physicians, healthcare aides, and so on, even though they constitute a smaller percentage of the overall population. So this is part of the story. This is a backdrop to the story I want to tell today. The pandemic did impact international mobility for a while. But, friends, even in the face of unprecedented global travel restrictions, the challenges surrounding global migrations did not go away. The crisis of mass migration and the calamitous displacement of peoples did not cease. Throughout 2020 and 2021, in different parts of the world, people were uprooted and they moved in significant numbers. There was a displacement crisis in the Sahel region in Africa. Then there was the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which triggered another massive wave of migrant movements. Then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 that set off the fastest mass migration in Europe in at least 3 decades. A year later, bloody civil war erupted in Sudan. All in all, by the time we get to May 2023, the year up to that date marks the largest ever single year increase in forced migrations in the history of the UNHCR. And this was before the recent developments in the Middle East. I'm using the pandemic as an important reference point because that historic occurrence and aftermath has taught us or should teach us important lessons about global migrations. Let me share a few of these with you. First, the inequities of international mobility. Not all international migrants are equal. This shouldn't come as a surprise, but in the few years into the pandemic, blatant discrimination, racial rejection became more prominent, part of the narrative of migration. But few incidents demonstrated the inequities more clearly than the Ukraine refugee crisis. To neutral observers, the open arm welcome for those fleeing Ukraine stood in stark contrast to the treatment of previous waves of refugees from places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And the most obvious reason appears to be that the people affected were white. The outrage that had greeted previous waves of migrants transformed into a very different sort of response and language and media, if you please. To the end that in April 2022, Tedros Ghebreyesus, the head of WHO, lamented publicly that the ongoing emergencies in Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria had garnered only, in his words, a fraction of the concern for Ukraine. Let me be clear. 85% of the world's displaced people are hosted in developing countries, not by wealthy developed nations. And since I'm here, I want to address what I call the African myth. Africa contributes a smaller percentage of migrants than the rest of the world. Just 2.5% of the African population are international migrants. And of that group, less than half leave the continent. Okay? So we're looking at, when we talk about the inequities of migration, we're talking about perception, responses, and the general narrative that surrounds these incidents. The second lesson is maybe equally obvious. Human migration is unstoppable. Remember, during the pandemic, media coverage mainly focused on lockdowns, travel bans, and depicted a world on hold. For a while, it seemed like, yes, the world was on hold. But the crisis of mass migration will not even be paused by a global pandemic. And the fact that these things were happening in other parts of the world perhaps is why the Western media got away with it. But ultimately, rigorous travel restrictions, unprecedented border closures did little to stem global migratory flows in the long run. In fact, I want to tell you that they triggered an upsurge. So, as the economist pointed out, foreign-born populations in wealthy nations are now rising at a faster rate than at any other time previously. Anti-migration was one of the most powerful impulses behind Brexit. Yet post-Brexit, Britain has experienced an unprecedented rise in migration from other parts of the world. In 2022, 1.2 million people moved to Britain, almost certainly the most ever in a single year. The US media is now converged over a narrative about a crisis at the border. In 2023, 2.5 million migrant encounters occurred at the US-Mexico border. That was the highest ever on record. And by the way, slightly more than half of those migrants don't come from Latin America at all. And in case you think I'm leaving you out, Canada is more welcoming to immigrants. We might press that. Still, the 437,000 received in 2022 was record-breaking. Migration flows globally did not stop. In fact, some will now be inclined to say a new wave of mass migration has begun. I have two more lessons for you. Third, we learned that anti-migration and global migration are inseparable. Okay? We might think, oh, there's an incident there of hostility to immigrants. There's an incident over there where they're not as welcome. But we discovered globally that these two things actually go together. Anti-migration is just as entrenched as international migration itself. Even before the pandemic, a Pew survey conducted in 27 countries discovered that on average, 45% of inhabitants want fewer or no immigration. And let's be clear that this hostility I'm talking about is worldwide. So in both developed and developing nations, from India to South Korea to South Africa and Brazil to Canada to US, it's been a similar story. What the pandemic did was expose how inseparable these two things are. And remember, these are often pre-existing sentiments. The pandemic galvanized them. In the US, anti-Asian American hate incidents mounted rapidly during the pandemic. Even in China, African immigrants faced abuse and discrimination from local authorities based on false rumors. In Europe and North America, casual racism, open hostility, verbal abuse in public to immigrants became very common. Now, if I emphasize anti-immigrant sentiments in Western countries, it's for a reason. Now, the majority in these publics, according to the data that's available, continue to view immigration favorably. But attitudes have been shifting in the last 2 to 3 years. So in Canada, for instance, 2021 data indicates that public opinion is almost evenly split You will have to tell me whether that's true or not. But even then a slightly higher percentage, 39%, think that immigration should be lower, versus 34% who are satisfied with the levels. So what I'm trying to say is that while anti-immigrant sentiments are worldwide, they tend to be more prominent in Western countries because anti-immigrant sentiments in Western societies are more specifically anti-non-white immigration. They constantly fuel public debate and they impact electoral politics more decisively. But if you're looking for the most powerful indication of the deepening antipathy to global migrations in the last 2 decades, I will give you the proliferation of border walls. You know, just over 30 years ago, the fall of the Berlin Wall was celebrated as marking the end of an era of fixed borders and immobility, celebrating a new era of movement, of international movement and cooperation. Yet today, the situation is much worse. Border walls have been proliferating around the world. By one estimate, 74 border walls exist across the globe, and most were erected in the last 2 decades. At least 15 more are in some stage of planning or development. And 32% of border walls are mostly intended to halt unwanted immigrants. Friends, the point is that the historic rise in global migrations has been accompanied by a massive increase in anti-immigration globally and the intensification of efforts to keep out unwanted migrants. And our last lesson. It's related, of course, but the resurgence of Christian nationalism in Western nations during the past 2 decades has been the subject of much research and analysis. And there is a case to be made that this is also part of a global rise in religious nationalism and extremism. But the pandemic bolstered Christian nationalism because it legitimized border closures and open suspicion of foreign-looking inhabitants. It also tapped into that pre-existing and long-standing opposition to non-white immigration I've talked about. Friends, what I describe, or what I refer to as Christian nationalism, can take on a variety of forms and expressions. Okay? It covers a wide spectrum of adherents, from silent sympathizers all the way to ardent advocates. But its basic convictions are clear enough. It equates Christian identity with a particular national heritage and definite territorial boundaries. It prioritizes political power and influence over personal piety. It views Christian beliefs and practices as markers of belonging. It helps them decide who belongs or who fits in and who does not. And Christian nationalism is strongly opposed to multiculturalism and non-white immigration. We have to take into account the complexity and fluidity of religious beliefs and identity. But the upsurge in popularity and acceptance of the kinds of sentiments and convictions associated with Christian nationalism should be a source of alarm. Back in 2018, a Pew survey of 15 countries in Western Europe made 2 important discoveries. The first was that negative sentiment towards immigrants and religious minorities tends to be higher again among those who claim to be Christian. Second, that Christians as a whole tend to express higher levels of national sentiment in those societies. Now, based on recent research, Christian nationalism is growing almost everywhere, including here in Canada, where we have to say still remains relatively minor and definitely less pronounced than is the case in the U.S. The rise of Christian nationalism in the U.S. is well documented. Surveys show that it is endorsed and embraced by some 30% of Americans. That is a high number. The most recent survey in 2023 concluded that 52% of Americans who attend religious services weekly or more are Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. Now, why am I talking about Christian nationalism on a topic that has to do with global migration and Christian witness? I'm glad you asked. Here is a simple, and I will unpack this a little bit in a minute. Here are two things to hang your hats on while I continue with this conversation. Christian nationalism has had a decisive impact on attitudes to immigrants. Okay, and fuel certain views about migration. The negative perceptions of migration and immigrants is an issue. It's highest among those who espouse these beliefs. Second, in the US at least, there is some indication that a long-term decline in Christian affiliation among whites, who are now a minority of the Christian population, is a factor in the upsurge of Christian nationalism. So that is something that's worth thinking about. So sympathy with the ideology is greatly fueled around anxieties related to cultural dominance that Christians have enjoyed for some time. And this is its greatest predicament, because Christian nationalism enshrines a massive distortion of the church's witness. This tendency to prioritize cultural identity over allegiance to Christ, or even put political power above the good news of the gospel, threatens the church in some ways more than it threatens the wider society. Few areas of church life today are more corrosive of faithfulness to the values of the kingdom than the positions assumed by Christian nationalism. This is something that needs more attention than it is getting from those who are sitting in our pews, even though they also include Christian nationalists. Well, let's move on. The link between global Christianity and global migration is one of the most fascinating. And you may be tired of hearing about the shift in the demographic center of gravity and the new era of Christianity that is centered in the non-Christian world, but this is relevant. The majority of Christians today live outside Europe and North America. 21st century Christianity is predominantly non-white. Presently, more Christians speak Spanish than any other language, and the margin is not even close. The long-term decline of Christianity in Western Europe is well documented. Remember the slide you saw before. Most adults in Western Europe still claim or identify as Christian, but roughly 18% of the adult population attends church at least once a month. And only about 11% of adults across Western Europe say religion is very important. Overall trends might suggest that Americans overall are more religious than Western Europeans, But over the last 3 to 5 decades, published findings paint an emphatic picture of steady decline in the number of Americans who claim a Christian identity. So that is now roughly 63%, which is the lowest ever. I believe Canada, by comparison, it's 48% of the population that considers themselves Christian. In the US, long-term decline is more prominent among Protestants than it is among Roman Catholics. And the pace of decline seems to be accelerating. Polls indicate that 48% of Americans say religion is very important to them, but attendance of religious services, church, synagogue, mosque, has fallen to 30%, which is an all-time low. In Canada, again, I think it's 15%. But there's one thing, friends, we need to consider. This decline is a white Christian issue to a large extent. So again, America is no longer a majority white Christian nation. And the fact that disaffiliation is highest among white Christians and predominantly white denominations is part of this story, part of this assessment of the church's witness. I believe that this element, and by the way, I want to be clear, this is not about making racially charged statements. This is not about emphasizing the divisions. This is about recognizing that erosion of Christianity, specifically among white populations and denominations in the West, is a major issue for the global church. That is an issue that deserves closer and more critical attention, because the causes, factors, and implications have significant bearing on the church's witness and mission. And we need to get past simply lamenting the trends and beginning to think in Christian terms, in biblical terms, in theological terms, why this is and what it means. But for now, this new shape of Christianity globally, this new re-emergence of Christianity as a non-Western religion, has great implications for the church's missionary engagement. There's a clear correlation with the new centers of the faith and migration flows that is the exact duplicate of earlier correlations between mass migrations of Europeans and the directions and impact of Christian missions. Now, I told you I would come back to this. So I want you to bear in mind that it is very likely that Christians constitute nearly half, if not more, of the world's international migrants. There are all kinds of data to support it. More than 50% of immigrants in the EU identify as Christian. And in the US, some 65% of new immigrants are Christian. So this correlation is important. In major cities in North America and Europe, immigrant congregations continue to multiply rapidly. And in some contexts, they're increasingly the most visible face of Christianity to highly secularized populations. Immigration has a lot to do with the fact that London is the most cosmopolitan and also, listen to this, the most religious city in England. People of African descent, according to reports, account for only 14% of London's population, but make up 60% of church attendance. It's not just a story about African immigrants. Britain attracts many Filipinos who are 86% Christian. The recent influx of immigrants from Hong Kong. By the way, Hong Kong is 16% Christian? But Christians are disproportionately represented among the immigrants who have identified, who have ended up in the UK. And some estimates suggest nearly half of those immigrants are Christian. Certainly, most Cantonese-speaking congregations in Britain doubled or trebled in the last 2 to 3 years. Even Brexit has contributed. Post-Brexit has witnessed the first skilled visas issued in the UK for clergy to cater for the need for clergy to head congregations. Friends, my point is not that the religious vitality and growth of churches in London is only due to non-white immigration. There are lots of areas of vitality. I'm not suggesting that somehow immigration is a solution to Christian decline and disaffiliation. This is one reason why I find the notion of reverse mission somewhat problematic, but we wouldn't go there tonight. The point at issue is that the religious landscape in Europe and North America today, specifically with regards Christian life, existence, mission, and ministry, cannot be fully analyzed without reference to massive non-white immigration. And this is precisely why, again, the rise of Christian nationalism presents such a formidable threat to the church's witness. Let me close by centering my comments on the American experience that I've studied most and that I've lived within. So, America has resumed its status as the chief destination of the world's international migrants. You can see the details on the slide. The percentage is lower than Canada's. The numbers are higher. And please note that the majority, 77%, are in the country legally, which you might not get if you're just listening to the media. What is key, though, is that unlike previous waves of immigrants, the current wave is predominantly of non-European stock. This wave of migration that we're living through has had a tremendous impact on the religious landscape. And that impact is likely to be the most extensive ever in America's history as a country. And the implications for the American church are quite profound. So, from a broad perspective, the immigrants come from diverse religious backgrounds. They're Muslims, they're Buddhists, they're Hindus, and those numbers must be acknowledged, even though the combined total is just a tiny fraction of the immigrant population. What is often overlooked in the debates and even in Christian responses is that this post-1965 immigration is predominantly Christian. I mentioned earlier, Christians account for about 65, some might go down to 60, some might say 62. It's still a large number, the majority of the foreign-born population in the U.S. The U.S. admits more Christian than Muslim refugees. The widespread association of Arabs with militant Islam obscures the fact that the majority of Arab Americans in the U.S. are Christian. The numbers are quite simply staggering. By even the most conservative extrapolation, over 30 million Christians have been added to the American church in the last 50 years. Not by conversion, not through the ministry of the church, simply by immigration. This is a crucial and significant finding. I tell American congregations and in public lectures like this all the time, we must ask ourselves, those of us who actively pray for a clear sense of what God is doing in the world, why is it that these kinds of developments in the history of the church are completely lost or denied amidst the sound and fury of our debates and self-reflection? The American church has no excuse. Immigration is foundational to American Christianity. Every single major denomination in the U.S., with perhaps one exception, began as a group of immigrants meeting somewhere. This has been part of America's history. So, at the very least, global migration and the church's witness are irrevocably linked. Biblically, theologically, historically, migration has been pivotal to Christian mission. How the church responds to outsiders, foreigners, and immigrants has always been a distinctive element in its ministry and life. So I guess the billion-dollar question is whether this recent immigrant influx compensates for the erosion of Christian affiliation and membership. It might, but probably not as much as some expect. American Catholicism, for instance, has been largely bolstered by immigration, especially Hispanic immigration. And we know that church attendance and ministries are more vital and higher among immigrants than among the homegrown population. But whether that's the case or not, throughout Western societies, this new era of immigration that includes this large percentage of Christians is changing the face and future of the church. And it has now become, for those who are paying attention, in many ways, one of the most significant tools the church is being given for a new era or century of challenges and perplexities. Christian immigrants are major sources of multiculturalism. That is true. But we're not paying attention. Since the majority of new immigrants in the US are non-white, the church is diversifying and browning at a faster rate than the wider population. That trend is likely to replicate itself in many other societies in the Western world. The fact remains that in Western societies today, massive immigration has brought Christians from diverse communities throughout the world into closer proximity than ever before. Yes, we must acknowledge that migration is at the heart of the most serious predicaments and challenges that confront governments, but also Christian congregations and Christian leaders. And there's little doubt that concerns around immigration and the challenges associated with it, including integration, these concerns must be taken seriously. And Christians must try to be on the forefront of addressing such concerns. But friends, this is a new age. And our attitude and response to the outsiders and foreigners in our midst will be inseparable from our ability to demonstrate the renewing and transforming power of God's new community. The unprecedented nature of global migrations today is a vital reminder that the spread of God's kingdom is not fully measurable by human standards, nor does it fully conform to human expectations. But at a minimum, partaking in God's mission calls for a readiness to see Christ in the stranger, the refugee, and the outcast. Thank you.
Friends, there's opportunity for questions both online and here in person. If you have a question online, you can just type it and Hunter will ask it out loud. And if you're in the room and you have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
This is a very kind audience.
I have a question. Has there been any research? Your analysis of immigration, half of the people, global immigrants coming to the West, around the world, are Christian. What happens to them when they come to Canada? They arrive as Christians, are church attenders, but what's the influence of sort of Western secularism? Has there been any study in terms of what happens to a second generation in relationship to church attendance? Do they begin to look like the longer-term population, or is there continued commitment to the church and its mission and ministry?
Right. That's a very important question. There are a number of things to say. First of all, different immigrant groups encounter, settle, maintain Christian life within that host environment in different ways. There are a number of different factors that would shape how well or how enduring, the sense of congregational life and ministry is. So we have kind of some sort of disparate, assessments coming out of this. So in some cases, the assessment seems to suggest it takes until the third generation before you begin to see a sort of a meaningful drop, say in church attendance and affiliation. But that is in some ways complicated by the fact that by the time you get to the third generation, what church is like, how church is created and encountered has become somewhat different. And so there was a mistake made, for instance, with Korean immigrants when some of you might remember about 20 years ago, there was this talk of the silent exodus, which is to say, the second generation are leaving the churches in droves and so on and so forth. And subsequent research seemed to indicate, they were going to college and they were now forming new multicultural associations with other Asian Christians. So yes, they were not returning to the Korean church, which can have its own distinctives, and that's one area where immigrant churches tend to be similar. The second generation usually either struggles or definitely shows intent of finding a way to do church that is not sort of beholden, or some might even say captive, to the way the second generation conceives of these things. And I feel like different generations navigate those transitions and those challenges differently. But the one thing that we must not overlook is that whatever the tensions, and by the way, intergenerational kind of differences are universal. They tend to be more intense among immigrants because so much is at stake. But the one thing that we should bear in mind is they might move away, they might not attend churches regularly, but they have typically been Christianized and nurtured in terms of their spirituality and identity within congregations that were necessary for that. And so in that way, the congregations, as far as they remain, have this ongoing contribution to whatever, the host country's life, spirituality, and ethos. Yeah.
Thank you. This is kind of an adjacent question to that. Do you have information or any kind of statistics about immigration populations that come and integrate into existing church communities versus creating their own church community? And is there differences among different immigration populations and cultures, if you have any information on those ideas? Thank you.
Okay. So similarly, one thing you never want to do is generalize about immigrants, okay, in any context. So predominantly, immigrants form congregations or their own places of worship, because it's more than a place of worship. It's also about their culture, their identity, their ethos, and so on. And the dynamics varies from country to country. In the US, that's been practically the case for every immigrant wave, that they come in and form their own congregations, and so that's not new. In any case, in many countries and societies, church life and participation is already segmented. Whether we like it or not as Christians, we have to admit that Christians like and prefer to worship with people like themselves. Sometimes even when you have a multi-ethnic congregation, they occupy a certain socio-economic bracket. Okay, there's another commonality that you can point to. But for the most part, yes, immigrants tend to sort of congregate and set up their own congregation and life. In terms of integration, it's a mistake to extrapolate from sort of immigrant congregational formation to whether in fact they're integrating, because those are two different things. So in the discourse today, we talk about selective assimilation. Immigrants have to assimilate. They don't have a choice. In fact, they often want to, desperately. Okay. Learn the language, become part of the educational system or the job market, and so on. What tends to happen is, in churches and in their homes, there are certain things that they preserve. But when they're in the wider society, they want to be accepted and acknowledged as equal. It's even more intense within second generation, who constantly do what is called code switching. Okay? They will act and behave in certain ways depending on the setting. But the last thing I would say, confine this comment to African immigrants, among whom I've done most of my research, the majority of African immigrant pastors who established congregations did so after they faced rejection from homegrown churches and congregations. The majority of them did not come to the US to start a congregation. I don't know if you've met immigrant pastors. It's a hard way to do ministry. The majority of them ended up being pastors because of the sort of alienation they encountered in homegrown congregations. That includes the largest African church in the UK today, Kingsway International Christian Center. The founder, dealt with that, and he left and started to form his own ministry. So I guess one way to, again, end the answer to your question is to raise the issue of what more homegrown congregations need to do to bridge that gap. The gap is there, and it's not manufactured by one side or the other. It's a reality of the diversity of global Christian experience. But we have a lot to offer each other. And that's where the witness and ministry may be losing a huge opportunity.
Thank you for your comments. And I was enjoying the slides because I'm a British citizen and I came in 2022, so I was part of that 400-something thousand who came to Canada that year.
So you have contributed to this international migration.
Myself and my wife were two of those, yeah. I also have a bit of a problem with the term reverse mission, but I wonder if you could comment on how immigrant churches are affecting the perception of what Christianity is in Western countries, because I think everybody in the West has an idea that they really know what Christianity is. And I mean, I've been to the Kingsway Church in London. It's a very impressive setup, but it looks nothing like the kind of tiny village Anglican church that most people would think Christianity was. And sure, there's something that can be scary and just different because it's other, but it's also vibrant and full of life, and there's a certain enthusiasm for the faith there. I just wonder if you could comment on how that might affect the views of Christianity in the West and what the implications might be for mission, despite the difference in worship styles and theologies and so on. What might it do for the church in general in the West? Okay. If anything.
Again, a very important but also complicated questions. The first thing I would say is Christian life in the West, outside immigrants, is not monolithic. So already Christian life and ministries in the West are very diverse, complicated, has its own divisions and the like. Those divisions are more intense in some countries and places than others. So then, now you deal with immigrant Christian communities coming in huge and significant numbers with very different theologies, spiritualities, approach to worship, thinking about Christian engagement with society, and so on and so forth. And they too are not monolithic. There's quite a wide scope of immigrant Christian manifestation and expression. And in fact, a significant segment, I talked about the alienation and rejection, but at least in the US, a significant proportion of immigrants actually find a home within homegrown denominations and congregations. Okay? To the extent that some denominations ended up looking for an African pastor to pastor that congregation that suddenly had so many Africans attending that they realized that they needed to do something about the leadership, for instance. So that's an issue. But there's no question that this massive sort of addition or influx of Christian immigrants has significantly enlarged the expressions, the identities, the approaches to Christian life, ministry, and spirituality. I have to put a question back to homegrown churches. Will this be seen simply as an issue of difference that has to be rejected, or as a glorious opportunity that allows us to learn from and engage with each other, recognizing that that would still be a difficult task? It's time there are very few examples of this, by the way, but when homegrown churches and immigrant churches have been able to come together and work it out, oh my friend, it's one of the most glorious things you might see as they both begin to benefit and make room for each other. But the main narrative is distance, alienation. I feel in that respect, the onus is really on the host denominations and churches. Immigrants have to deal with so much by way of rejection, hostility, and the lack of welcome, whether in their own lives as immigrants or seeing it in their children in school, or whether it's in the workplace, or just as the narrative changes around them towards them. They have to deal with all. So the church, you would think, is maybe the one place where there's a new spark, there's a difference. And I say this while also I realize, I have to acknowledge that there are many Christians, ministries and congregations that are on the front lines of making sure the new immigrants feel at home. And those are important ministries. But in my experience, they are the exception. And the reason I've flagged Christian nationalism today is because that phenomenon, and it's a growing one within Western societies, and taking many shapes and forms, will significantly undercut and undermine the new possibilities and potential that I would say represents what God is doing in the world.
Okay, we have a question online. Hunter, please.
Yeah, we've actually had two come up here. And apologies to the Zoom attendees. I didn't notice chat was disabled. So if you had been waiting to ask a question, chat is working now. First question comes from Brent. He asks, does challenge or resistance to immigration come about because of numbers or volume? Managing immigration with compassion seems necessary when hospitality logistics can otherwise be overwhelmed.
I think that is the last part of the question.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The last part of the question was what?
Oh, sorry, he says, managing immigration with compassion seems necessary when hospitality logistics can otherwise be overwhelmed.
Okay. So to the first part of the question, remember what I said, anti-immigration and immigration? In many Western societies, but then definitely in the US, anti-immigration and immigration have gone together hand in hand from the very beginning. I could read you excerpts from going all the way back to the 18th century that you would think were published yesterday. And the immigrants, the focus of these statements about not belonging, about not wanting to integrate and so on, in one case were Germans. In other cases were, Roman Catholics, and then, the Irish. These anti-immigrant sentiments also tend to come to the fore in situations of economic crisis and political turmoil and so on and so forth. So these things have always, so we have to recognize that. And the church, unfortunately, has often been complicit in some of these attitudes. The exclusion laws passed against the Chinese in the US in the early 19th century were passed at precisely the time when American missionaries were flocking to China in unprecedented numbers. Okay? So those disconnects are something that we need to have conversations about and begin to address. The other thing I would say is, research seems to indicate that most Christians' views on immigration don't come from the Bible. I'm getting an amen from the pastors. No, it doesn't. It comes from political affiliation. It comes from a variety of other ideologies. And there's data to back this. It comes from conversations with family and friends. We need to change that. The Bible as a document on the issue of, I can go on and on about this, on the issue of migration, the outsider, the stranger, it is such a powerful tool for educating and thinking in Christian terms about this phenomenon. So yes, compassion, welcome, but also addressing in a real way the concerns, the challenges of immigration. Those things are not mutually exclusive. But with so many of our responses, the lack of compassion is distinctive. And that is something that should worry us as a church.
So
yes, ma'am. Sorry, you've been
That sounds
patient.
like Christian hospitality. We need to pay attention to that. But my question is in relation to the gap that you asked. How do we bridge this gap? And I want to point us to the network that we have as the Anglican Communion in relation to migration. So coming from those countries, all the churches would know who their members are coming into the Western world. So if we can have a system where we have the sending churches connecting with churches in the international sphere, then that's a catchment for our members, and they won't be just left to drift. Secondly, there is the issue of teaching English language. We have a good network of teaching. Can we therefore address this by way of opening up our different institutions to teach the English language so that our people can come to us for that and then they find their way into the churches. These are the two things I want to place on the table.
Right, yeah, that's an important contribution. How much we need more of those kinds of collaborations, partnerships, openness, and ways of showing hospitality and welcome as a counter to the other more prominent, more visible examples we have. There's so many churches we know where when immigrants move in, the whites move out. Not only in the neighborhood, but in the churches too. When the congregation pastor decides to engage the immigrant, and the congregation the numbers are going down, they're spending more on the building than on anything else. The numbers are going down, and the pastor says, there are people in our midst, and the pastor reaches out. There's so many stories. When that happens, but we need more of these kinds of stories, more of these kinds of models and examples to counter, it's a counter narrative I often feel is lacking. Because Christians are involved in so many things that reflect faithfulness to the kingdom, faithfulness as followers of Christ. But those who are counter, those who are undermining, those who are coercive, they are louder, they seem to be more focused, more determined, more single-minded in what they're doing than the rest of us are. And our silence and reticence is actually, Richard and I were having this conversation, sometimes they bank on that. They bank on the fact that we will not be as aggressive, we will not match them, and they take full advantage. And for the witness of the church, that needs to change, in my view.
Thank you. Hunter, we have another question online, please.
Yeah, the next question online is, if the culture streak is so influential in the Christian migration phenomenon, what chances do we have that the church can be a unifying factor in our polarized world?
What's the first part? If the what?
If the cultural streak is so influential in the Christian migration phenomenon.
If the cultural streak?
Streak, yes.
Okay. So, cultural identity and diversity is intrinsic to Christian identity. Okay? It reflects the power of the message of the gospel. It means that if I'm Nigerian, I don't have to become an Australian to encounter Christ fully. If I'm a Norwegian, I don't need to become a Canadian to encounter Christ. I can encounter Christ fully within my own cultural heritage and identity. Okay? That is, central to the universal vision. That is why we say, in Christ, all. In Christ, all. That means, regardless of your culture, your background, experience, in Christ, all. No one has any advantage over any other person. God does not have a favorite culture. So those cultural elements are important. They allow us to encounter Christ fully. But it's the nature of human existence that those cultural elements can also be, I think the word today is weaponized, but those cultural elements can also be used to feed division. But typically when that happens, it's when we make our culture the full embodiment and end and perfect expression. So, yes, you don't need to be another culture to encounter Christ fully, but no cultural expression is full. No cultural expression is complete. No cultural expression is a model for everybody else. So it's those two things that we need in a biblical understanding and theology to address this question of how the same diversity and multiplicity of cultures becomes part of the church's witness. Okay? That we belong together. We don't want to have... Can you imagine what the church would be like if every Christian in the world was Nigerian? No, but you want that? I don't. or if every Christian in the world was British. No, I mean, we do understand that great promise in Revelation 7:9. A great multitude that no one can count from every language, culture, nation. Yeah, that is the promise. In other words, we need each other to experience the fullness of what God has done in Christ. None of us by ourselves or in our own context are going to get that. We need each other for that. So that's what we are called to. And you will agree with me, we fail more than we succeed, I think, in making that work. But I feel that that's the thing we always keep striving for. So these immigrants coming with their own sort of cultural expressions, spiritualities, and understandings are actually a gift to the church, not a source of disunity and strife. I mean, that could happen, I mean, yes, but generally, I think from a pastoral point of view, that is where we need to get our thinking straight and understand the witness we are called to.
Hi, I have a follow-up question for the relationship between homegrown churches and immigrant churches. And what I'm hearing is that to bridge that gap, a lot of the responsibility lies on the side of the homegrown churches. I'm an immigrant, and I attend a homegrown church, and it's a church that has strong heritage, is very confident in its own heritage, but that also allows space for a more cosmopolitan side of new immigrants within its own congregation. And something that we have tried is that we have reached out to immigrants' congregations or ethnic congregations to collaborate on cultural events. But when we make that connection, even when we are very direct and straightforward about the goals of those events, the response has often been met with suspicion and hesitation, sometimes because of the goals or the power dynamic between homegrown churches and smaller immigrant churches, but also sometimes on the differences on stances of social issues like marriage. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. I hope I'm not suggesting that this is going to be easy. And some of those differences, divergences, are unbridgeable. They're unbridgeable even without immigrants being present. And churches are being split over certain issues and questions. So that's not an issue necessarily confined to this conversation about immigrants and homegrown churches. But what you're saying is important. There is a responsibility on both sides. But it has to be a journey. It can't be one invitation. It has to be more than one invitation. We must call on not only leaders, but individuals on the pews to be part of the commitment to forging those ties, connections, and alliances. This is why it seems to me often that simple things like female representation or the absence of female representation can be a liability. Because trust me, mothers with kids come together much more easily than, say, this pastor and this other pastor. There are so many different ways and different issues that we can come together to do. And if the starting point is, we worship together and so on, doesn't work, it doesn't have to be the starting point. It could be we join together for something that the community needs. Anything that brings us alongside each other should be on the table. But again, it may not work. And perhaps if it doesn't work with one congregation, it might work with another. So my view is, I spend so much time on these issues and these questions in research and in interviews and conversations. My sense is, for the most part, immigrant churches and congregations are more open to this than the other way around. But of course, there are going to be instances where the reverse is also true. That the homegrown church is keen, but there isn't. But I feel that that shouldn't be a reason to stop. We are members of the same family. We don't have to like each other. We're called to love each other. See? And so that in some ways, that is itself an extension of hospitality, that we say we won't give up, and really fully explore ways of doing this. But the suspicion you're talking about, that caught my attention. I'm afraid, I'm sorry I keep harping on Christian nationalism and so on, but that language, those ideas, those sentiments are making many immigrant churches cautious about how they engage the wider society, about how open they are to other Christian groups and Christian movements and ministries. They are also learning to be cautious. Because the environment is either so polarizing or seems to be less and less hospitable and compassionate when it comes to issues of immigration and immigrant existence. But I want to applaud the fact that you as an immigrant are already in those spaces. Again, I keep saying we need more of that. We need more of that. We need that counter. There are too many churches I know that will send a mission team to all the way to Ghana or Mexico, will have nothing to do with the Hispanic church or the African church just around the corner. So there's a lot. We have a long way to go. There's a lot of work to be done. But my conviction, maybe my hope, is that the more we get others to understand how important this is for the church's witness, maybe we begin to move the needle a little bit.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. The next one is online, please. Hunter?
Great, yeah. This question comes from Dr. Angela Parker, who I believe is also teaching a summer school course this week. She asks, the Western Church, I think, has always seen itself as the decision maker of Christianity. How can we get out of that mode and actually live in the difference that comes with the migration that occurs within global Christianity calls for? And she adds, and we need to get folks to read the Bible and see the issues of migration.
The contribution of the Western Church to global Christianity is extraordinary and exceptional. And I lament the fact that seems to be increasingly lost in some of our discourses. The sacrifice, the model of commitment and engagement that it has demonstrated in the past. And I understand that the reason why that is increasingly lost is because complicity and the church being co-opted in political agendas and initiatives and so on has been a big part of the problem. But I feel like it's a disservice to emphasize the one and forget the other. So we need to recognize these 2 things about the Western Church. The Western Church needs to come to terms with its own frailties and understand the need for repentance, because without that, reconciliation with others might be difficult. But we're now at as far as the Western point, still assuming positions of privilege, power, and domination. I think that happens in certain circles, but not in others. You might know certain circles where that is still an issue, and circles where it's not. But that is much more broadly a Western issue and not confined to the church. Even in what you might term secular domain, you have the same assumptions, the same notions, the same normativity complex about what is the West, is the model, is the exemplar, and so on. And churches around the world are learning to deal with that, are learning to wrestle with that. I suspect that there's a similar issue here, that where those relationships are being rethought and being renewed, not being talked about, they're not as visible, the impact is not as well acknowledged. But we do have a problem. And one of the reasons I talked about the reverse mission thing being a problem is because it's reading off the old hymn sheet. In part, it's like, oh, they came this way, they came and they did this, they did that, and on and changed. But the Western Church never did that. You know, where transformations have taken place in a way that is enduring and sustained, it's always required primary and robust indigenous leadership, initiative, and enterprise. And that's not going to change in what you're calling, what we sometimes call reverse. But again, it's the acknowledgement that we need, the recognition that we need each other. And I mentioned how, in fact, this deep disaffiliation within white involvement in churches, it's a problem for the global church. For now, some of us might think, oh, it's a problem in the West, or Christianity. It's a problem for the global church. And it's one that we need to think about seriously in terms of its implications and impact. And perhaps it might open the way for us to understand that the witness and mission of the church is always more effective and enduring when it is collaborative and when it crosses lines in ways that acknowledge partnerships in the work of God, not empire, not domination, not control mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So in that regard, yes, we have a long way to go, but let's also acknowledge where there are these new lights of possibilities emerging, even in the horizon.
Thank you so much. A few years ago, I heard a lecture from Professor David Foote, who is University of Toronto professor, whose major is economic relation to population. And he said, if you know the demographic trend, you know 70% of everything. So tonight you show the picture, and then we can grasp almost 70% of everything in this kind of trend. Thanks so much. So my question, maybe two, maybe one. So why our Christianity, Western civilization, it's getting hard to make hospitable or open door in terms of embracing the Christians who are coming from this country. Why we cannot make Western civilizations is making very hard or not embracing other immigrants to our soil. And second question is, from my experience, pastor in immigrant church in Toronto, before that, this is kind of trend. All immigrants are not equal in terms of purpose, in terms of the reason to come to other country, or in this case, Canada. In my case, I came to Canada to study further. Probably economic reason. Others maybe political reason, maybe refugee. All their reasons are different. So in these regions, do you have any data or any indication how they are forming Christianity or churches in new soil?
Based on what?
Based on their reason. For example, yeah.
To take the last first, no.
Oh, okay.
And for the most part, there are seldom single reasons why people move. Okay? And so I will take the opportunity to reject the very common assumption, the very common division between migrants and refugees. Refugees are forced to move, migrants choose to move. That maybe serves a legal framework for countries, but in real life, it's nonsensical. For the most part, people don't uproot themselves and move to a distant place if what they need and to sustain themselves and live their lives is present where they are. Okay, let's just take that as an easy caveat. So most movement is forced in some sense. A mother who embarks on a journey with a child, knowing full well there's a 50% chance that neither of them will make it. It's making a choice. She could stay, but you're making a choice. But what does that tell you? So the degree of compulsion can change, yes. There are different degrees of composure. Sometimes it's instantaneous, But for every refugee, there are many more who did not move, who remain caught up in that same situation. And the many who did not choose to move, who later on became refugees because they didn't choose to move in the first place. And the many who move and become refugees after they move. I mean, the permutations can be, so there are all kinds of complex interaction of reasons that shape migration and migrant movement. I'm making that clear because that helps us to understand global migrations. Okay? In some ways, experts will tell you why people don't move is a more complicated question to answer. Okay? So, but yes, in terms of forming congregations and so on, no, it's difficult. The only thing I would say in the U.S. experience, those who come in as refugees tend to end up in certain parts of the country, in certain states. And so then churches are formed that way. But migrants are social human beings too. And migrant movement is shaped to a great extent by social networks. So they end up or try to go where there are people already there that form community, and that too can shape. But in terms of whether you're an asylum seeker, a refugee, a doctor, a student, and so on and so forth, yeah, there's no real data on that. And by the way, this is not just non-whites. Remember, Westerners move too. But Westerners, as is often the case, are very reluctant to apply labels that are commonly applied to non-whites to themselves. So Westerners who move describe themselves as what? Expatriates. Oh yeah. If you take your mind back to I challenge you to do this if you have the time. Go back and listen to media coverage of the Ukraine crisis. The media was convoluting itself to avoid using the word refugee to describe European movement. It wasn't even, well, it was too funny. But no, yeah, so labels are used for certain groups and not for, we can go all down the road to unauthorized, undocumented, and now these are sort of applied in ways that paint a picture that's often not quite accurate. Okay? I believe the first part of your question had to do with Western civilization. I said earlier, Christianity takes root within certain cultures and contexts, in certain epochs and ages. Within the Western world, Christianity took root in a very specific form that hasn't happened anywhere else. That form was Christendom. It took root in a way that allowed the emergence of an idea that a place can be described as Christian land, Christian territory, Christian nation, and ultimately Christian culture. Okay, so those sets of assumptions are actually unique to the Western phase of Christian expansion. But it's one phase. Important phase, you might say, but it's just one phase. There are many other different phases in Christianity's 2 millennia of existence. But that phase became, in some ways, to enshrine some of these issues we're talking about, where a particular culture sees itself as normative in terms of Christian identity and practice, to the point where it convinces itself that those forms, those structures, those institutions should be exported, recreated, reinstituted, imposed on others, because this is what Christian life. And I mention this because we know that is wrong, but to be honest with you, it's actually a disservice to the West itself. Because when you create that kind of box, then you're no longer open to the enrichment, to the of exchange and interaction and ongoing sort of infusion of ideas and values that are part of the kingdom of God, that were not part of your original experience to begin with. So I do a lot. I taught mission history for a long time. One thing I will tell you, the most effective foreign missionary becomes a convert first. You cannot be effective if you simply leave and try to implement only what you knew and left behind. Because what God will do in that new environment, that new context, will not be a duplicate. That may be what you want. That's not going to happen. It will not be a duplicate of what you might try to create that. Will it be enduring? Will it create new life? Will it? No. And so that ability to recognize that and be open to that new transformative effort of conversion of the church emerging in a completely different context with its own religious tradition, ideas, aspirations, and so on, that's something the foreign missionary learns from. In a way, yes, the foreign missionary shares the gospel, but he learns a lot more about the potential of the gospel in that act. Sometimes than do the potential converts learn from him. Does that make sense? I'm getting into lecture mode here. I better stop. But no, so it's Western civilization has had to kind of deal with the legacies of its own sort of cultural formation in terms of Christian life. And that's still working itself out today. And by the way, Christian nationalism is a natural outgrowth of that heritage.
Yes, I really thank for tonight's speech. Here I would like to share a story of partnership. I am a minister of Vancouver.
Did you say a story of partnership?
Yeah. I am the minister of the Taiwanese church in Vancouver. We belong in Presbyterian Church in Canada. Yeah, I am really know we are an immigrant church. I'm very grateful to the Presbyterian Church in Canada for showing hospitality to immigrants from Taiwan. We belong a minority group, but we are willing to integrate to the local church. We are and our partner church, Candler Presbyterian Church, we accept African church, African refuge for years. I'm glad that they have slowly integrated into local life. This is very meaningful work. We will continue to pay attention to this kind of ministry. Yeah.
All right. I think we're done. Well, thank you guys for this very rich conversation, for your contributions and questions and ideas.
Well, thank you so much, Jehu. I think, did everybody ask a question? Thank you so much for your lecture, for your presentation this evening. You can tell by the number of questions and the careful thoughts that came to you what great ideas and the encouragement to new practices you've given to us. So thank you very much, and we say a hearty amen. You were looking for it earlier. Because,
amen.
We were better off a script, we Presbyterians. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I found your talk prophetic.
All right, thank you.
Truly, I go to church in Istanbul. I work in Istanbul. And just what you said about the immigrants, it's